Hello again. Welcome to our next study here on Wednesday night. I hope that last week's study was helpful to you and that Sunday's service was an encouragement to all of you. You've been an encouragement to me as you've interacted with me during this time. As we continue our study in Habakkuk, a question that we may be asking is, where in the world has God gone? And we tried to do what's right. We tried to live for God. We tried to be lighthouses in a lost world. And now some of you have lost your jobs. Some of you find yourself in economic hardship. Some of you find yourself ill. Some of you find yourself in relational hardship. And the question can very easily be asked, where in the world is God? As you recall from Habakkuk 1 in our study last week, this really is the question Habakkuk was asking. He asked why God didn't see and why God didn't notice the problems that were going on in Israel. And God's response to Habakkuk was, I do see it. In fact, I'm going to use wickedness to take care of it. Habakkuk said, God, that's not how you work. Where have you gone? And so he concludes begins chapter 2, with this statement that he would wait for God to adjust his perspective, that he would take his stand at his watchpost and station himself on the tower and look to see what God would say, an answer concerning his complaint. This brings us then into chapter 2, because God is indeed going to answer him. And the answer that he gives to Habakkuk is very important for where we face today. So take a moment, pause the video, read through Habakkuk chapter 2, and then we will start back up. Okay, so you've read through Habakkuk chapter 2. Like many of the prophetic writings, you might be reading through it wondering, wow, that was different. Wonder what in the world that meant. So let's talk through it a little bit again. Once again, we could divide this chapter into two scenes. The first scene, verses 2 through 5, God gives a call for faith. He calls for Habakkuk to demonstrate and to lean into faith in God. In verse 2, he says, And the Lord answered me, Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by faith. So he tells them to do three things. He says, first, write this down. It means very similar to what that statement seems like today when we tell something, this is so sure you can write it down, it's going to happen. He tells Habakkuk, write this down. Write it down, in fact, on tablets of stone. Make it plain so everybody can know that I, God, am working. And then he tells him, you need to wait. You need to wait for God to work. He says, the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. We're reminded that God will keep his promises. We can be sure of this, that he who began a good work in us will complete it till the day of Christ. But we're reminded that God doesn't work according to our timetables. Often in the midst of our struggle, this is what we struggle with the most, the fact that God works on his own time, not on ours. That God does what he will, when he will, not necessarily when we want him to. God does not act in our own timeline, but we can be sure that he will act. We can be sure that it will come. So sometimes the call is to wait. To wait for the Lord to work. And in the meantime, we are to live faithfully. That's verses 4 and 5, where he tells him, the soul is puffed up. It's not upright within him. The righteous shall live by his faith. Wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol, like death. He is never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. He tells him, the righteous are going to live by faith. In the meantime, other people are leaning on all these other things. Some even are turning to alcohol. They're turning to things to inebriate themselves, to push these things out. And he says that's not the answer. The answer is to live by faith. Paul quotes this very thing in Romans chapter 1, verse number 17. We'll start in verse 16. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. The reality is, in these trying times, in these hardships, we are revealed by the faith that we demonstrate. Sadly, many Christians during this time have caused us to wonder. They're not responding with faith, they're responding with fear, or they're responding with arrogance and foolishness. Instead, we're commanded to live by faith. We see this pictured and thought about in Hebrews chapter 10, verse number 32. But recall the former days when you were enlightened. You endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which is a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and persevere there and preserve their soul. The reality is, believers are marked in the middle of trial, in the middle of hardship, by a steadfast faith in God. Not in ignoring or in ignorance of the challenges facing, but of a confident rest and a confident assurance that God is in control and that we can trust him. He provides hope here. But note that this hope is not for a life of ease. This hope is not that everything is going to be a bed of roses. No, it's a hope that God has not lost control, that he will work all things out for his glory. And so we can rest in him. One of the things that we must note in the middle of this is that God did not promise prosperity. God did not promise health. In fact, as we see, both of these things are being ripped from us. But the reality is, God has promised us his presence. God has promised us his good and eternal glory in Christ Jesus. And so we're called to live faithfully even in the midst of hard times. But why in the world would we do this? And how would we do this? Why would we want to respond in that way when it really doesn't seem all that helpful? Well, in the second part of this chapter, God gives Habakkuk justification for faith in him. Verse number 6, he tells us, well, let me begin by saying that he does this through giving a series of 5 woes. He proclaims woe on several things. It's not a word we use today. We don't go around proclaiming woe. But it was a phrase used often in that day. And really, it was a mocking phrase. It was a phrase that was used to pronounce judgment and mockery on that individual or on that group of people. And so he does this in 5 ways. The first one is in verses 6 through 8. He says, "Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, for how long, and loads himself with pledges? Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoiled for them, because you've plundered many nations. All the remnant of the people shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and to all who dwell in them." Now remember, the Chaldeans were the ones that were going to come in and take Judah captive. They were going to plunder Judah. And here in this text, God says that the plunderer would be plundered. These people who had taken advantage of all the people around them would in turn be taken advantage of themselves. The ones who had run through and heaped up what was not their own, it would be taken from them. We see this fulfilled later in Daniel chapter 5. We'll be referring back to this text quite often as it lays out what exactly happened. Daniel chapter number 5, verses 28 to 31, Daniel is reading through. I'm going to start at verse 24. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. This is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So here we have this account where Belshazzar had come into the kingdom, and he had accumulated all these things for himself through his own work and the work of his father and his grandfather. And he held a party for his own glory, and he brought out the implements from the temple in Jerusalem, the sacred cups, and they were partying with them. And this hand appears and begins to write things on the wall, and Belshazzar is fearful. He's reminded of this man that he'd long forgotten, a man of God named Daniel, who would interpret for him what was written. And so he brings Daniel in, and Daniel tells him, your kingdom's over. The plunderer is now going to be plundered. And indeed, that's what happened. The Medes and Persians came in and overthrew the Babylonian Empire and took from them everything that they had, and that very night killed Belshazzar. We see secondly in Habakkuk 2, in verses 9 through 11, that the secure would be thrown down. Verse number 9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You've devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You've forfeited your life, for the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. And so we're reminded of even the way that they were overthrown. Chaldeans had come through and conquered the world that was known. They had taken God's people, Judah, captive. But God reminds Habakkuk that he will hold the Chaldeans accountable for their work. They thought they were secure. The picture is of a bird's nest high up on the cliff where nothing can reach it. This is how the Babylonians pictured themselves. They built these massive walls around Babylon and thought that they could not be breached. Little did they know that that very fateful night, the Medes and Persians had actually redirected the river that ran under the walls so that they could walk under the walls and plunder the city. In their own security, as they partied thinking they were secure, they were thrown down. We're reminded of Psalm 127, verse number 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It's been interesting over the last several weeks to watch our economy. About a month ago, we were rejoicing, we were boasting and bragging in how strong it was, in the records that were being set, in the wealth that was being accumulated. And in a matter of a few short weeks, it's been absolutely decimated. And we're reminded that it's not our own strength, it's not our own ability, it's God who builds the house. You know, we thought that we had security, we thought that we had it all together, and a microscopic virus changed everything. Reminded us that we're not in control, that our security is not found in us, that our security is found in God alone. The third woe that he proclaims is found in verses 12 through 14, where he tells them that the empire will be reduced. He says, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts, that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. He says this, you've built a town with blood, you founded it on iniquity, but God didn't do it, and so it will be thrown down. You know, it's interesting that that very night it was thrown down. But instead, he says, the knowledge and glory of God will be revealed. You see, God's concern is not for the stability of our country. God's concern is not even actually for the longevity of our country. God's concern is for a kingdom that is far greater, that far surpasses our own country. See, we're citizens of something far greater than our citizenship here in the United States. The knowledge and glory of God will fill the earth. It may be through decimation, it may be through blessing, but the knowledge and glory of God will fill it. And the day is coming when he will return, and all will see him for who he is. And on that day, Philippians tells us every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. So we need to be careful about what we worship. We need to be careful about what we trust. If we trust in our economy, well, a little bug just might mess it up. If we trust in our own abilities, well, a little bug might mess that up too. The reality is, the only thing that we can trust in that is secure is God himself. The final woe that he pronounces is found in verses 15 to 17, and that is that the corrupt would be disgraced. He says, woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. The Chaldeans had wreaked havoc. They were vile. They were wicked. They had oppressed people. They had forced them to do that which they did not want to do. We saw that in Daniel 1, when the men of that time taken captive were commanded to violate their present laws in order to follow the law of the king. And now we see that the corrupt would be disgraced, that it would be turned, that they would not handle. We see in Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, that Belshazzar made this great feast for thousands of his lords and drank wine in front of the household. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and that the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. And they brought these golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple in the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall in the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. We see this picture of them having this drunken orgy, and God intervenes. The reality is, in our day, it's easy to look around and to see people who are corrupt seeming to succeed. But the reality is, God is still on his throne, and one day they will answer for their corruption. He tells us in verses 18 and 19 that the idol will be worthless. He says, as he goes on in this proclamation to Habakkuk, what profit is an idol? When its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? Or its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols? Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, and to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. He reminds us of the worthlessness of our idols. This day they were handcrafted statues that people worshipped, made of stone that could not speak, and yet they worshipped them. Today we have a little bit more technologically advanced designer idols that we worship, but they also cannot satisfy. They also cannot supply. He says, can these idols talk? When we say to them, awake, do they wake up? We're reminded of 1 Kings chapter 18, with Elijah on Mount Carmel. Remember, as Elijah comes to Mount Carmel with all these prophets of Baal and Ashtoreth, and he tells them whichever God brings down fire from heaven, that's the true God. And he lets these other false priests go first. And so they're working and they're trying to get these false gods to call down from heaven, and it's not working. And so Elijah starts to mock him. I kind of like Elijah. He's a little sarcastic. He says, I don't know. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe you need to wake your God up. So they get a little louder. So, well, maybe he's on a trip. Maybe that's what's going on. You need to get him back. My personal favorite. Maybe your God is in the bathroom. I don't know. What's going on? And they get louder and they cut themselves trying to get Baal and Ashtoreth to listen. And verse 29 is so insightful in 1 King 18. It says, there was no voice. No one answered. And no one paid attention. The reality is, the problem with our idols is that we're struggling, or asking them to do things that they cannot do, to provide us with peace and security and happiness that they cannot give us. And when we go to them for those things, no one will answer, no one will hear, no one will pay attention. Now, all these things that we had trusted have been taken away from us, and we're stuck in our homes. And if that's what we're trusting in, it feels empty. It feels lonely. But that's not our God. Notice verse number 20. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. God still reigns. He's still in his holy temple. He's still in control. No matter the hardship you're facing, no matter the intensity of the trial that you are enduring, God still remains. And so we're to be silent before him and to trust his work. I'll give you two things to walk away with from this study today. First, remember that God is in complete control. As the world seems to fall apart around us, remember, God still reigns. He's not left his throne. He's still in control. So, number two, live a life dominated by faith. Live a life that reveals that you are indeed a believer. Live a life that demonstrates you are not worshiping worthless idols that cannot supply for you, but you're worshiping the God in heaven who's still on his throne and who will always supply. Next week, we'll look at Habakkuk chapter 3, an incredible, probably the most important chapter as we look at this life of faith when things are in turmoil. Until then, may God bless you. We love you. If we can serve you in any way, please let us know.